You've seen this loaf. It's probably sitting on your counter right now. Soft, springy, 9 days after you carried it home. Not a spot of mold, not a hard heel, nothing. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a quiet little voice says that just isn't right. Here's what I found out. The bread on our shelves is built to fool you into believing it's fresh, while the bread our grandmothers pulled out of a wood stove cost pennies and stayed good for a week without a single chemical. That knowledge didn't vanish by accident. It got quietly replaced. And almost nobody noticed. I only cracked it because of a cookbook printed in 1913 that most Canadians have never even heard of. By the end of this, I'll walk you through the exact method inside it, a trick that keeps a loaf soft for a week using something you pour down your drain every single day. And you can do it in the kitchen you already own, renting or not. No fancy machine, no new oven, nothing to buy. Last winter, up the Ottawa Valley, I stood in my own kitchen and set 2 loaves side by side on the counter, one from the store, one I'd made myself. What happened to those 2 loaves over the next 7 days is the whole reason I started digging. Let me take you back to the beginning, because it didn't start with bread at all. It started with a news story about a bakery chain across the water. I was up late one night, and there was a segment about Greg's, the big British bakery outfit, the one on every corner over there selling sausage rolls and pastries by the millions. Folks were talking online about how their food seemed to last and last. A sausage roll left in a cupboard, still looking fine days later. Pastries that didn't seem to know how to go stale. And people over there were starting to ask the obvious question. What exactly is in this stuff? Now, I'll be honest with you. My first thought was, that's Britain. That's their problem. But then I walked into my own kitchen the next morning and looked at the loaf on my counter. I'd bought it the better part of a week and a half before. And it was still soft. Still perfect. And that quiet little voice spoke up again. So I did something I hadn't done in years. I baked a loaf myself, the plain way, flour and water and yeast and salt, the way my mother did it. I set it right beside the store loaf, and I waited. By day 3, my homemade loaf was going firm. By day 4, it was fit for toast, and not much else. By day 5, it was a doorstop. Meanwhile, the store loaf sat there, soft as a pillow, smiling at me. Same air, same counter, same kitchen. One turned to stone in 4 days. The other refused to age at all. That's when I knew I wasn't looking at better bread. I was looking at different bread. Something had been done to that store loaf that had never been done to mine. And I needed to know what, and I needed to know when somebody decided we shouldn't be told. But here's the part that got under my skin. If the store can make bread last a week, that means it's possible. It means fresh-tasting bread that keeps for days isn't some miracle. So why did my grandmother's bread go hard in 2 days? Was she doing it wrong? Or was she doing it honestly, and had simply lost a trick that the old-timers before her once knew? I started where any curious man starts. I asked the oldest people I know. There's a fellow near me, past 80 now, grew up on a farm outside Renfrew. I asked him straight out, when you were a boy, how long did a loaf of bread last in the house? And he laughed at me. He said, son, bread never lasted long enough to go stale, we ate it. But then he stopped, and he thought, and he said something I wrote down that same night. He said his mother's bread stayed soft for the better part of a week, and it wasn't the yeast, and it wasn't the flour. It was the potato. The potato. I thought he'd lost the thread, but he was dead serious. He said his mother kept the water she boiled the potatoes in, and she never ever poured it out. That water went into the bread. And that bread, he swore, stayed tender for days when the neighbor's bread went dry. Now, I'm a skeptic by nature. A story from a boyhood memory is a nice thing, but it isn't proof. So I went looking for it, written down somewhere, in black and white, from back when this was common knowledge and not a curiosity. And that's when I found the book, The 5 Roses Cookbook, first put out in 1913 by the Lake of the Woods Milling Company out of Keewatin and Winnipeg, Manitoba. This wasn't some little pamphlet. This was one of the most widely owned cookbooks in Canadian history. They gave it away with flour. It ended up in something close to 1 million Canadian kitchens in the years after it came out. For a whole generation of women in this country, from the Maritimes to the prairies, that red-covered book was the Bible of the kitchen. And there it was, in the bread section, plain as day. Recipes calling for potato water. Recipes calling for mashed potato worked right into the dough, not as some fancy specialty loaf. As the ordinary, everyday way you made bread that fed a family and lasted through the week. So my old neighbor wasn't spinning a yarn. He was quoting, without knowing it, a method that was printed and distributed to Canadian homes more than 110 years ago. A method that worked so well it didn't need explaining back then. Everybody just did it, which raised a much bigger question. If nearly 1 million Canadian households once had this written down on their shelf, how on earth did it get so completely forgotten that a grown man like me had to hunt it down like buried treasure? Because here's the thing that started to bother me. Knowledge like that doesn't just evaporate. Something has to come along and push it out. Something has to make people stop reaching for the potato water and start reaching for a bag off a shelf instead. And I wanted to know exactly what that something was, and who made money when it happened. Now, therefore, I had to understand why the potato worked at all. Because if I was going to trust it over the store loaf, I needed the reason, not just the folklore. So I dug into the actual science of it, and this is where it got good. When you boil a potato, the water fills up with starch. Fine, invisible starch that leaves the potato and dissolves into the water. That starchy water does two things in bread dough. First, it feeds the yeast. Potato starch is easier for yeast to eat than plain flour, so the dough rises stronger and softer. Second, and this is the real secret, that starch holds on to moisture. It grabs water and won't let go. So the crumb of the bread stays damp and tender for days instead of drying out and going hard. That's it. That's the whole trick. Moisture that stays put. A loaf that fights off staleness not with a chemical, but with a humble potato most of us peel and forget. And it costs you nothing. You were going to boil potatoes anyway. You were going to pour that gray water down the sink anyway. Our grandmothers looked at that same pot and saw a free ingredient. We look at it and see waste. That's the whole difference between how they lived and how we live. Now, the store solved the exact same problem, keeping bread soft, but they solved it a completely different way. And this is where my stomach turned a little. Modern factory bread stays soft because of things added to it on purpose. There's a family of additives called mono and diglycerides, sometimes labeled as dough conditioners or emulsifiers. Their whole job is to keep the crumbs soft and slow down staling, doing artificially what the potato once did naturally. Then there's calcium propionate, a mold inhibitor. That's the one that stops the fuzzy green from showing up for a week or more. It's what lets a loaf sit on a shelf, in a truck, in a warehouse, and still look bakery fresh when you finally get it home. None of this is a secret exactly. It's right there in the ingredient list, if you can read the fine print and if you know what the words mean. But nobody sat any of us down and explained that the whole reason store bread behaves so differently from homemade bread is that it's been engineered to. It looks fresh because it's been built not to age, not because it is fresh. And here's the date that told me the real story. Calcium propionate came into wide use as a bread preservative through the 1930s and into the 1940s. That's the window. That's when the switch got flipped. Before that, if you wanted bread that kept, you used the old methods, the potato, the careful storing, the honest craft. After that, the factory could just add a compound and skip all of it. And once the factory could do it cheaper and faster than any woman at home, the pressure was on to convince that woman she was wasting her time. So think about what that means for the timeline. My old neighbor outside Renfrew was a boy right around then. He caught the tail end of the potato water world. His mother still did it. But his children? His grandchildren? By their time, the bread came in a bag, sliced, wrapped in plastic, soft for a week, and nobody had any reason to ask why. The knowledge didn't die in a single generation. It got quietly starved out over about 40 years, and somebody profited from every loaf of that bag bread. That's not me being dramatic. That's just arithmetic. Every home that stopped baking became a customer for life. But I still hadn't answered the question that started all this. Was the old bread actually better, or just cheaper? Because if the factory loaf is just as good and I'm saving a nickel, who cares? So I kept pulling the thread, and what I found about cost and quality is the part I think will make you angry. Let me show you the numbers, because this is where it stops being a history lesson and starts being about your own wallet. A loaf of decent bread in this country now runs you somewhere between $3 and $5, and if you buy the good bakery stuff, more. Call it $4 a loaf to keep it simple. A family that goes through 3 loaves a week is spending about $12 a week on bread. Over a year, that's better than $600 just on bread, just on the one thing our great-grandparents made at home for almost nothing. That question sent me looking backwards, and the further back I went, the stranger it got. If this kind of digging speaks to you, the feeling that real, practical knowledge got buried somewhere between your grandmother's kitchen and the grocery store shelf, I put a lot of what I've uncovered into a book. It's called Canadian Edge, and it goes deeper than any single video can. There's also Canadian Complete and Deep Canadian, each one built around the same idea that Canadians once knew how to live well on very little, and most of that knowledge is still recoverable. You'll find the details in the description below. But first, let me take you back to that old neighbor outside Renfrew, because his answer changed everything. Now here's what it costs to make it yourself, the old way. A big bag of flour, 10 kilograms, might run you $15 to $20, and it'll give you more than a dozen loaves. Yeast is pennies a loaf, salt is nothing, and the potato water? You already paid for the potatoes, and you were throwing the water away. So a homemade loaf, made the 5 Roses way, costs you somewhere around $1, maybe $1.25, all in. $1 a loaf against $4 a loaf. That family spending $600 a year on bread could be spending closer to $150. That's $450 a year staying in your pocket for the price of learning one skill your grandmother had by the time she was 12. And that's before we even talk about what's in it. Your homemade loaf has 4 things in it: flour, water, yeast, salt, and the potato water. 5 things. All of them you can pronounce. All of them you'd feed a child without a second thought. The factory loaf has that, plus the conditioners, plus the preservatives, plus the extra sugars and gums that go into making a dough that can survive a week in a warehouse. I'm not a doctor, and I won't pretend to be one, but I know which loaf I'd rather have on my table. And I know that for hundreds of years, Canadians got through brutal winters, hard work, and lean times on the simple loaf, and they did just fine. So now I had the why, and I had the numbers. What I still wanted was proof I could hold, and that brought me right back to those 2 loaves on my counter, and to a test I finally ran the right way. Now, before I show you exactly how it's done, I want to talk to you directly, because I know what some of you are thinking right now. You're thinking, this is fine for someone with a big farm kitchen and a wood stove and all day to fuss, but I rent. Or I've got a little galley kitchen in an apartment. Or my house is 60 years old and the oven's seen better days. This isn't for me. I want you to hear me clearly. This next part is especially for you. You do not need a special kitchen for this. You do not need a bread machine, a stand mixer, a proofing box, or any gadget a salesman ever tried to sell you. This whole method was invented by people who had far less than you have right now. They had a bowl, a pot, an oven, and their 2 hands. If you've got those, you're already better equipped than the woman who first followed this recipe in 1913. Here's the part you can do this very week, in whatever kitchen you've got. The next time you boil potatoes for supper, don't pour that water out. Let it cool down to just warm, about the temperature of a baby's bath, where you can hold your finger in it comfortably. That's your bread liquid, ready to go, and it costs you nothing. You don't even have to bake bread the same night. That potato water keeps fine in a jar in the fridge for a couple of days. So a renter with a tiny kitchen and a busy week can boil potatoes on Sunday, save the water, and bake on Wednesday. No contractor, no permit, no landlord to ask. Just a jar of cloudy water that most people throw away, sitting in your fridge like a little secret. And if you've never baked a loaf in your life, that's fine too, because the old recipe was written for beginners. It had to be. Half the women who first read it were young brides who'd never run their own kitchen. It was written plain, and it was written to work. That's the beauty of the forgotten way. It was never meant for experts. It was meant for everybody. So let me give you the whole thing, the way I finally pieced it together from that book and from the old-timers who still remembered. This is the payoff. This is what all the digging led to. Here is the method, start to finish. Start with your potatoes. 2 medium potatoes, peeled and cut up, boiled in about 2 cups of water until they're soft. When they're done, you don't drain them into the sink. You save every drop of that water. Scoop the potatoes out and mash up one of them. About half a cup of plain mashed potato, no butter, no salt, no milk, just the potato. Keep the other for your supper. Let that potato water cool until it's just warm to the touch. Too hot and you'll kill the yeast, and that's the single most common mistake. So take your time. Warm, not hot. Measure out about 1½ cups of that potato water into a big bowl. Put the warm potato water, the half cup of mashed potato, 1 tablespoon of sugar or honey to wake up the yeast, and 2¼ teaspoons of yeast, which is one of those little packets if you buy them that way. Give it a stir and let it sit for about 10 minutes. When it goes foamy on top, your yeast is alive and happy, and you're on your way. Now add about 1½ teaspoons of salt and 2 tablespoons of soft butter or lard if you've got it, though you can leave that out. Then start working in the flour, about 4 cups of all-purpose, a cup at a time, until it comes together into a dough that's soft but not sticky. You may need a touch more or a touch less. Flours like that, trust your hands. Turn it out onto a floured counter and knead it for about 8 to 10 minutes until it's smooth and springs back when you poke it. This is the part people dread, and it's honestly the best part. It's the part where you slow down. Our grandmothers did this every couple of days for their whole lives, and they'd tell you it was the calmest 10 minutes of the day. Put the dough in a greased bowl, cover it with a cloth, and set it somewhere warm to rise until it doubles, about an hour to an hour and a half. The potato makes it rise faster and higher than plain bread, so don't be surprised if it really takes off. Punch it down, shape it into a loaf, drop it in a greased pan, and let it rise again for about 45 minutes. Then into an oven at 375 degrees for about 30 to 35 minutes, until it's golden and sounds hollow when you tap the bottom. And here's the moment of truth. That loaf will still be soft on day 4. Soft on day 5. My own test loaf, the potato one, was still good for sandwiches on day 6, while the plain loaf beside it had gone hard by day 3. Same kitchen, same air. The only difference was the water our grandmothers refused to throw away. That's the secret. That's the whole thing. A humble potato, doing quietly and honestly what the factory does with a list of chemicals you can barely pronounce. It was printed in nearly 1 million Canadian kitchens in 1913, and it worked so well that the only way to make us forget it was to sell us something that faked the same result and told us it was progress. I want you to sit with how strange that is. This wasn't lost knowledge in the sense that nobody wrote it down. It was written down beautifully. The 5 Roses cookbook is still out there. Libraries have it. Families have copies passed down. The knowledge never truly disappeared. It was just crowded out, one bag of soft bread at a time, until a whole country forgot it ever knew how to do this for itself, and a few people never let it go. That old fellow near Renfrew, his mother before him, the keepers of those red cookbooks who never threw them out, they held onto the thread while the rest of us dropped it. When I asked, they handed it right back to me, like it had been waiting there the whole time. And now I'm handing it to you. Because that's the part that got me, in the end. Nobody hid this from us with a lock and key. They didn't have to. They just made the alternative so cheap and so easy and so soft that we stopped asking questions. We traded a skill for a convenience, and we never noticed the trade was even happening. The potato water going down the drain in millions of kitchens every single day is the sound of that forgotten knowledge quietly leaving the house. But it doesn't have to leave yours. Not now. Not after tonight. So let me leave you with this. What we lost wasn't just a bread recipe. It was the plain, steadying knowledge that we could feed ourselves, well and cheaply, without asking a factory for permission. That's what was really taken, one soft loaf at a time. And a jar of cloudy potato water in your fridge is how you take it back. If you're the kind of person who always felt something was a little off, who looked at a loaf that wouldn't go stale and thought that just isn't natural, then trust that instinct. You were right the whole time. You're the kind of person who suspects that a lot of real knowledge got buried, not because it was useless, but because someone else made more money once we forgot it. And you're the kind who'd rather know than be comfortable. Now, I've got a question for you, and I really do want you to answer it. Did your mother or your grandmother ever save the potato water? Did she have some little kitchen habit like that? Something that seemed odd to you as a kid and makes perfect sense now? Tell me about it. Type it right down in the comments below, because between all of us, we can rebuild the things that got misplaced. I read them, and half of my best leads come from people like you sharing what their families knew. If this stirred something in you, come along with me. This isn't just a channel. It's a whole bunch of us, quietly reclaiming the practical skills that were nearly wiped from memory, one method at a time. Subscribe and stand with us, because there's more, a lot more, and I don't want you to miss it. Next time, I'm going after something that's been sitting in your grandmother's pantry the whole time. There was a way people kept butter fresh for months, on the counter, no fridge, no power, and it's so simple it'll make you wonder how we ever forgot it. I found the method in an old settler's account, and I tested it myself. It works. And once you see it, you'll never look at that stick of butter the same way again. So keep that potato water. Bake that first loaf this week. And when it's still soft on day 5, you'll know exactly what our grandmothers knew and what somebody spent 40 years hoping we'd never remember. And that potato water is exactly where I pick up on the inside. In the Northern Ways Circle, I walk you through the 1913 potato water loaf, step by step, right from where I stopped. Get stuck? Ask me directly, a real person, me, answering, no bot. You'd belong among thousands of practical folks like you. Just point your phone's camera at the code on screen. Cancel anytime, one click. I'd love to have you.